Our first arguments lecture came to an end as we were considering that second step in this process, the step of understanding and formulating an argument that we've identified as existing in a bit of spoken or written language. We noted that the overarching goal of this step is to develop a sympathetic formulation of the argument that maximizes the argument's comprehensibility, its rigor, and its impact by creating what's oftentimes called a standard form version of the argument. We went on to note that a standard form version of the argument structures the individual component statements of the argument so that all of the premises appear first and the conclusion appears last. It further orders the premises within the argument to facilitate the consumer being able to identify the connections between ideas that mirror the underlying structure of the argument and that drive the transition from initial information to conclusion. And in this way, the argument is being built in a way that's very similar to the way someone would build that stepping stone bridge across the river, placing each stone so that it's easily identifiable and so that the person crossing the river can make that transition from one stone to the next easily. Their progress is unimpeded as they move from one side to the next. In order to do this, we said we have to be able to identify the premises and the conclusion of our argument, and we noted that the use of premise and conclusion indicators can help to facilitate that, but that ultimately what we're trying to do is cultivate this judgment ability to understand the arguer's intent, their dialectical or argumentative goals, so that we can say that the person is driving towards establishing this conclusion in virtue of offering these reasons. We further suggested that as part of creating this standard form version of the argument, we may want to rephrase elements of the argument to help facilitate making the structure more apparent. One thing we want to do is to make sure that each premise appears in the argument as a separate declarative sentence, as an individual declaration, so that the consumer of the argument will follow from one simple and straightforward declaration of a fact to the next simple and straightforward declaration of a fact, and so on. We also want to make sure that the terminology that's used to introduce content phrases in the argument is consistent throughout, so that every time a particular bit of content plays a role in the argument, the same phrase is used in the same sense, so that the consumer of that argument is able to quickly and easily re-identify those content elements and follow the relationships that they're used to establish in the argument itself. We said that we may need to eliminate extraneous material. We want to be, of course, very careful that we don't eliminate material in a way that undermines the integrity and flow of the argument. And so we want to exercise caution in eliminating elements. For instance, when they're common knowledge, we may recognize them as common knowledge and think that they're unnecessary in order to establish a connection. But we don't want to make that assumption on the part of the argument's consumer. We don't want to make them work that much harder in order to see the connections between ideas. If there is a bit of common knowledge that connects ideas within the argument, we don't want to eliminate that because we don't want to make the consumer of the argument work that much harder to bring up that common knowledge and then use it to make the connections between the ideas, when we can easily include it in the argument and allow them to just follow along as those connections are being made. We also want to be careful when we're thinking about eliminating elements of the arguments that use the same words or phrases that are used in previous premises or in following premises or conclusions. We want to make sure before we eliminate arguments with the same sorts of terminology that in fact they don't provide a connection between ideas that we just didn't observe or notice when we first decided we might want to eliminate them. We want to be careful always to do no harm when we are eliminating information from an argument. We want to minimize the demand on the argument's consumer's working memory, but we don't want to try to do that so aggressively that we end up undermining the flow and structure of the argument, making it more difficult for the consumer to understand and follow it from beginning to end than it would be if we had left that content in. Similarly, we want to be careful not to eliminate an arguer's reference to sources for the information that they cite. When someone refers to an authority, when someone talks about where they got a particular bit of information, this too is a bit of information. It's part of the evidential base of the argument. And so we don't want to eliminate that because it gives the consumer of the argument not just the information that's presented, but a sense of where that information came from. And as we've seen repeatedly throughout the term, identifying the sources of information can greatly enhance the credibility of that information or conversely undermine the credibility of that information. And so it provides important data for the consumer of the argument in determining and evaluating the content of that argument. Finally, we noted that just as we may want to eliminate extraneous material to avoid overloading an argument consumer's working memory to facilitate the rigor and comprehensibility of the argument, we might also want to actually add some information for the purposes of connecting ideas together explicitly and clearly, and thereby facilitating the easy transition from one idea to the next within the context of the argument. And here too, there are some rules of thumb that we might want to adhere to in deciding whether or not to include information. The potential threat in adding information is that we add information that makes the argument better. It improves its overall, for instance, underlying structure, but it undermines the overall efficacy of the argument because it makes the premises as a group less likely to be true. So we don't want to add information that superficially increases the plausibility of the argument by decreasing the plausibility or the likelihood that the premises are all true. And so when we think about whether or not we want to add missing information, there's two sort of general rules that we should adopt. When we're thinking about information that is general knowledge or information that's uncontroversially accepted as true, then what we want to do is decide whether or not the addition of that common knowledge or otherwise uncontroversial knowledge provides an important connection within the argument between ideas that facilitates an easier transition between those ideas in the context of the argument. When we're considering adding information to an argument to facilitate that transition between ideas, but that information maybe isn't true in our own light, or certainly isn't uncontroversial in the larger context of society, then we want to remember that our goal here is to develop a version of the argument that's consistent with the arguer's intent and knowledge. What are they trying to do? What do they believe? And so in these cases, we want to only add information when it's clear that the arguer would have acknowledged the truth of that addition, and when that addition provides important connections within the argument. In other cases, even if we're tempted to add information to an argument, we should probably resist that temptation so that we come up with that maximally comprehensible, rigorous, and impactful version of our argument in our standard form iteration.